Blood drenched the Montana sunset as Wyatt Keller dragged another terrified woman onto the makeshift auction block outside Silver Creek's only saloon in the summer of 1876. Adelaide Calloway's wrists were raw from the rope that bound them, her honey blonde hair matted with dirt, and tears streaking clean lines down her dust-covered cheeks. 3 days ago, she'd been traveling west to teach at a frontier school. Now, she stood as property to be sold to the highest bidder in a town where law had long been forgotten. "Fresh from Boston, gentlemen," Keller shouted, yanking Adelaide's chin up. "Educated, too. Reads and writes better than most men. Good breeding stock for whoever needs a proper wife or whatever else you fancy." Laughter rippled through the crowd of miners, drifters, and ranch hands. Adelaide's stomach turned as she stared at the sea of hungry faces. The auction had already claimed 5 other women, each disappearing with men whose intentions were written plainly across their leering faces. A murmur swept through the crowd as a tall figure pushed forward. Bronson O'Malley's spurs jingled with each deliberate step, the dying sunlight catching on his weathered face. His dark eyes locked with Adelaide's, something unreadable passing between them. $5, someone called. 10, countered another. 20 for the blonde, a miner shouted, spitting tobacco juice dangerously close to Adelaide's feet. The bidding climbed quickly to $50, a small fortune in these parts. Adelaide closed her eyes, saying a silent prayer. She'd heard stories of frontier women taken against their will, but never imagined she'd become one of them. $100, came a deep, commanding voice. The crowd fell silent, parting as Bronson stepped closer to the platform. His hand rested casually on his holstered Colt, though there was nothing casual about the steel in his gaze. "Sold to O'Malley for," Keller began with a greedy smile. "I'm not bidding," Bronson interrupted, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "Untie her. She's coming home with me." No one moved. Not Keller, not the crowd, not even Adelaide, who stared at this stranger with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "This ain't charity, O'Malley," Keller snarled. "Pay up or step back." Bronson's movement was lightning fast. His gun cleared leather before anyone could blink, aimed squarely at Keller's forehead. "I said untie her." The silence stretched, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Then Keller's knife sliced through Adelaide's bonds, and she nearly collapsed as blood rushed painfully back to her hands. "You're making a mistake, O'Malley," Keller warned. "Sheriff Daniels won't like this." "The sheriff can discuss it with me directly," Bronson replied evenly. He holstered his weapon and extended his hand to Adelaide. "Miss, if you please." Adelaide hesitated only a moment before placing her trembling hand in his calloused one. Whatever awaited her with this stranger couldn't be worse than the alternatives. As he helped her down from the platform, the crowd parted silently, no one willing to challenge the tall cowboy with the deadly reputation. "My things," she whispered. "They took my trunk when they ambushed the stagecoach." "We'll sort that out later," Bronson replied quietly, guiding her toward a chestnut mare tethered nearby. "Right now, we need to leave." With surprising gentleness, he lifted her onto his horse before swinging up behind her. She sat stiffly, acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. "Hold tight," he murmured, and then they were galloping down Silver Creek's main street, leaving the auction and its horrors behind. The moon was rising by the time they crested a ridge overlooking a sprawling valley. Adelaide had remained silent throughout their journey, too exhausted and confused to form coherent questions. She'd expected him to take her to a cabin or homestead, but they kept riding, putting distance between themselves and Silver Creek. "We'll rest here for the night," Bronson said, finally breaking the silence as he guided his horse toward a stand of cottonwoods near a small creek. After helping her dismount, he busied himself with making camp, his movements efficient and practiced. Adelaide stood awkwardly, unsure what to do with herself or what this man expected of her. "Why did you do that?" she finally asked, watching as he kindled a small fire. "Why did you take me?" Bronson looked up, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "Sit down, Miss Calloway. You must be hungry." She sank onto a fallen log, accepting the jerky and hardtack he offered from his saddlebags. "You know my name." "Your name was on the manifest of the stagecoach that was robbed 3 days ago," he explained. "I've been tracking Keller and his gang since they hit it." "Are you a lawman?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, madam. Just a rancher with an interest in seeing justice done." "So you rescued me out of some sense of justice?" She couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "I rescued you because what they were doing was wrong," he said simply, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. "No woman should be sold like cattle." Adelaide accepted the cup, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "What happens now? Will you take me to the nearest town with a proper sheriff?" Bronson settled across the fire from her, his face half hidden in shadow. "That would be Coopersville, about 2 days' ride from here." "But Keller's gang operates with Sheriff Daniel's blessing. They share the profits from their robberies and the auctions." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air swept through Adelaide. "Then where are we going?" "My ranch is about a day's ride south of here." "You can stay there until I figure out how to get you safely to where you were headed." He paused. "Where was that exactly?" "Pinecrest. I was to be the school teacher there." Bronson nodded. "Good town, decent folk, but it's nearly a week's journey from here." Adelaide stared into the fire, the full weight of her situation settling upon her shoulders. She was alone in the wilderness with a stranger hundreds of miles from anyone who knew her, her possessions stolen. "Why should I trust you?" she asked quietly. "How do I know your intentions are any better than theirs?" His dark eyes met hers across the flames. "You don't, but I give you my word as a gentleman that you'll come to no harm with me. Tomorrow we'll reach my ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, will be there. You'll have a proper room with a door that locks from the inside." Something in his forthright manner eased a fraction of her fear. She nodded slightly, too tired to argue or question further. "You should get some rest, Miss Calloway. We leave at first light." Bronson offered her his bedroll, insisting he was fine with just his saddle for a pillow. As Adelaide wrapped herself in the wool blanket that smelled of horses, leather, and tobacco, she watched her rescuer through half-closed eyes. He sat vigilant by the fire, occasionally feeding it small branches, his profile sharp against the night sky. Who was this man who would risk his life for a stranger? And what would tomorrow bring? These questions followed Adelaide into a restless sleep, punctuated by nightmares of rough hands and leering faces. Dawn broke with a palette of pinks and golds that illuminated the vastness of the Montana Territory. Adelaide awoke to find Bronson already saddling his horse, a small fire crackling with a pot of coffee brewing. "Good morning," he said, not looking up from his task. "There's a stream just beyond those trees if you'd like to freshen up. I'll keep my back turned." Adelaide gathered herself with as much dignity as she could muster, making her way to the stream. The cold water was a shock against her skin, but she welcomed it, scrubbing away the dirt and fear from the previous days. She did her best to tame her tangled hair, wishing for a proper brush and clean clothes. When she returned to camp, Bronson handed her a cup of strong coffee and some dried apple slices. They ate in silence before mounting up, Adelaide once again positioned in front of him on the saddle. As they rode, the landscape changed from rocky ridges to rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen. By mid-morning, cattle appeared, grazing contentedly on the lush grass. Eventually, a large ranch house came into view, nestled against a backdrop of mountains, with several outbuildings and corrals surrounding it. "Welcome to Whispering Pines Ranch," Bronson said as they approached. The house was larger than Adelaide had expected, built of solid logs with a wide porch and glass windows, a rarity in these parts. As they dismounted, a plump, gray-haired woman hurried from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. O'Malley, we weren't expecting you back so soon." "And who might this be?" Her kind eyes took in Adelaide's disheveled appearance with concern rather than judgment. "Mrs. Fletcher, this is Miss Adelaide Calloway. She'll be our guest for a while. Miss Calloway, this is Mrs. Fletcher, the finest housekeeper west of the Mississippi." "Oh, you poor dear," Mrs. Fletcher said, taking in Adelaide's condition. "Come inside. We'll get you a hot bath and some clean clothes." Adelaide allowed herself to be led into the house, almost overwhelmed by its comfortable, lived-in atmosphere after her ordeal. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, solid furniture, and bookshelves laden with volumes that made her heart leap with unexpected joy. True to Bronson's word, Mrs. Fletcher showed her to a pleasant bedroom with a real bed, a washstand, and a door that indeed locked from the inside. The bath that followed was nothing short of heavenly, and the clean dress provided by Mrs. Fletcher, though a bit large, felt like the finest silk against her skin after days in the same soiled clothing. When Adelaide emerged, feeling somewhat human again, she found Bronson in the main room studying some papers at a large desk. "Better?" he asked, looking up. "Much, thank you," she hesitated. "Mr. O'Malley, I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No repayment necessary," he replied, setting down his pen. "Mrs. Fletcher has prepared lunch. You must be starving." The meal was simple but delicious: fresh bread, stew, and apple pie that melted in Adelaide's mouth. She ate ravenously, only belatedly remembering her manners when she noticed Bronson watching her with amusement. "I apologize," she said, blushing. "It's been a while since I had a proper meal." "No apologies needed." He poured her more water. "Now, Miss Calloway, we should discuss your situation." Adelaide set down her fork. "Yes, of course. Pinecrest is about 5 days' ride from here in good weather. I have business to attend to here for the next week, but after that, I can escort you there myself." "I couldn't possibly impose further," she protested. "Perhaps there's a stage-coach. The next stage heading that direction won't pass through Coopersville for nearly 2 weeks," Bronson interrupted. "And after what happened, I wouldn't recommend traveling alone." Adelaide's shoulders slumped slightly. "I've lost everything. My clothes, my teaching materials, the small savings I brought with me." "We can replace what you need," he said firmly. "In the meantime, consider yourself my guest. My ranch is yours to explore, though I'd advise staying close to the house." "Because of Keller," Bronson nodded. "He's not likely to venture this far, but caution is wise." That afternoon, despite her exhaustion, Adelaide explored the house, finding comfort in its solid walls and the books that filled the shelves. To her delight, she discovered a small library off the main room, with volumes of poetry, history, and literature that spoke of an educated mind. "My mother's collection," Bronson explained when he found her there, running her fingers along the spines. "She insisted on bringing civilization with her when she married my father and moved out here from Philadelphia." "They're wonderful," Adelaide said sincerely. "I was worried I'd have nothing to read in the wilderness." A smile touched his usually stern face. "Feel free to borrow whatever interests you." Over the next several days, Adelaide settled into a routine at Whispering Pines. She helped Mrs. Fletcher with household tasks, read from Bronson's library, and gradually regained her strength and spirits. Bronson himself was often absent during daylight hours, attending to ranch business, but they shared evening meals, during which Adelaide learned more about her rescuer. He had inherited the ranch from his father 5 years earlier. Before that, he'd fought in the war between the states, though he spoke little of that time. His mother had died when he was 16, his father just 5 years ago. He ran the ranch with the help of a foreman named Jenkins and a crew of cowhands who lived in the bunkhouse some distance from the main house. What struck Adelaide most was his fairness. Unlike many ranchers she'd heard about, Bronson paid his men well and treated them with respect, regardless of their background. Several were Mexican, one was black, and 2 were native Crow who had chosen ranch work over reservation life. "They're good men," he said simply when she commented on this. "A man's character matters more than where he comes from." On the 4th day, Adelaide was sitting on the porch, reading, when she spotted riders approaching at least 8 men moving fast. Her heart leapt to her throat. "Mr. O'Malley," she called, rushing inside to find him. He emerged from his office, instantly alert. "What is it?" "Riders coming. Many of them." Bronson moved to the window, his expression hardening as he observed the approaching men. "It's Keller with some of Daniel's deputies." He turned to Adelaide. "Go with Mrs. Fletcher. There's a root cellar behind the kitchen. Stay there until I come for you." "But now, Adelaide." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the urgency in his voice brooked no argument. "Mrs. Fletcher hurried her through the kitchen to a trapdoor in the floor, leading down into a cool, dark space stocked with preserved foods. The women descended, pulling the door closed above them. Adelaide could hear muffled voices, then the sound of boots on the porch. "O'Malley." A voice she recognized as Keller's called. "We've come for the woman." Adelaide couldn't make out Bronson's reply, but the tension in his voice carried even through the floorboards. Minutes stretched like hours as the women huddled in the darkness, listening to the muffled confrontation above. Suddenly, a gunshot shattered the air. Adelaide gasped, clutching Mrs. Fletcher's arm. More shots followed, along with shouting and the sound of breaking glass. Then, terrifyingly, came the crackling of fire. "They've set the house ablaze," Mrs. Fletcher whispered in horror. Smoke began seeping through the floorboards. Adelaide's mind raced. They couldn't stay here, they'd suffocate. But emerging meant facing Keller and his men. "We have to help Mr. O'Malley," Adelaide said, moving toward the ladder. "We can't just hide while they kill him and burn his home." "Child, what can we do against armed men?" Mrs. Fletcher protested. Adelaide's hand closed around a heavy jar of preserved peaches. "Whatever we must." Before Mrs. Fletcher could stop her, Adelaide pushed open the trapdoor and peered out. The kitchen was filling with smoke, but no one was present. She climbed out, helping the older woman up after her. "Stay here," she whispered, creeping toward the front of the house. Through the smoky haze, she could see Bronson on the porch, pinned down by gunfire from men positioned behind water troughs and wagons. Blood stained his left arm, but he was still returning fire, his face grim with determination. Adelaide's gaze fell on a rifle mounted above the fireplace. Her father had taught her to shoot years ago, believing every woman should know how to protect herself. With trembling hands, she took down the weapon, checking that it was loaded. Moving to a side window, she positioned herself and took aim at the nearest attacker, a deputy crouched behind a barrel not 30 yards from the house. She closed her eyes briefly, said a silent prayer, then fired. Her shot went wide, but it had the desired effect. The men turned in confusion, momentarily distracted from their assault on Bronson. He seized the opportunity, dropping one man with a well-placed shot. "Get down!" he shouted to Adelaide as bullets shattered the window above her. She ducked, heart pounding, then crawled to another window for a different angle. This time her shot found its mark, striking a man in the shoulder. He fell with a cry of pain. The tide of battle turned as Bronson's ranch hands, alerted by the gunfire, arrived from the fields. Keller and his remaining men, now outnumbered, retreated to their horses, firing wildly as they fled. "This ain't over, O'Malley," Keller shouted as he galloped away. Adelaide rushed to Bronson, who was now slumped against the porch railing, his face pale beneath its tan. "You're hurt," she said, examining his arm where a bullet had torn through the muscle. "It's nothing," he grunted, though his grimace belied his words. With Mrs. Fletcher's help, Adelaide got him inside, away from the section of the house that was burning. Ranch hands formed a bucket brigade from the well, fighting to save the structure while Adelaide cleaned and bandaged Bronson's wound. "That was foolish," he told her as she worked. "You could have been killed." "So could you," she retorted. "I couldn't hide while you fought alone." His dark eyes studied her face. "You're not what I expected, Adelaide Calloway. Neither are you, Bronson O'Malley." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits behind their very different exteriors. But there was no time to dwell on it as they joined the effort to save the house. By nightfall, the fire was extinguished. Though one section of the roof was damaged and smoke had blackened several rooms, the solid log construction had prevented the entire house from being destroyed. Adelaide helped Mrs. Fletcher prepare food for the exhausted men, her mind still processing the day's events. Later, as she brought a fresh cup of coffee to Bronson, who sat on the porch despite Mrs. Fletcher's insistence that he rest, Adelaide finally asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Why did you really save me from that auction block, Mr. O'Malley?" He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, almost confessional. "My sister was taken by men like Keller 3 years ago while traveling to visit me, by the time I found her." He paused, pain etching lines around his mouth. "She took her own life rather than live with what had been done to her." Adelaide's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." "I've been tracking Keller's operation ever since, gathering evidence, trying to find a way to bring him and Sheriff Daniels to justice. When I saw you on that platform." He shook his head. "I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." Impulsively, Adelaide reached out, covering his hand with hers. "Thank you, not just for saving me, but for telling me the truth." His fingers tightened around hers briefly before he withdrew his hand. "You should get some rest, Miss Calloway. Tomorrow will be a long day." But sleep proved elusive for Adelaide that night. She lay awake, replaying the events of the past week: her capture, her rescue, the attack on the ranch. And beneath it all, a growing awareness of the man who had saved her, whose quiet strength and principles had created this haven in the wilderness. The next morning brought new challenges. With Keller still at large and clearly determined to recapture Adelaide, staying at the ranch had become dangerous for everyone. Over breakfast, Bronson outlined his plan. "I'm taking you to Pinecrest now," he told her. "We can't wait. Keller will be back with more men next time." "But your arm, it's well enough," he interrupted. "Jenkins and the boys can handle things here. We'll leave at noon." Despite her concerns, Adelaide knew he was right. She spent the morning helping Mrs. Fletcher pack provisions for the journey and writing a detailed account of everything that had happened since the stagecoach robbery, including Sheriff Daniels' involvement with the traffickers. "I'll send copies to the territorial governor and the federal marshal," Bronson promised when she showed him the document. "Your testimony could be what finally brings them to justice." By noon, They were ready to depart. Bronson had saddled 2 horses, his chestnut mare for himself, and a gentle bay gelding for Adelaide. Mrs. Fletcher had provided her with a serviceable riding outfit and packed a small trunk with necessities that was strapped to a pack horse. "Be careful, my dears," the housekeeper said, embracing Adelaide. "God go with you both." They rode south, taking a circuitous route that Bronson assured her would be harder to track. Adelaide, though not an experienced rider, managed well enough, determined not to slow their progress. They spoke little during the day, both alert for signs of pursuit, but as they made camp that evening, the silence between them grew comfortable. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Bronson asked as they sat by the fire, eating the stew Mrs. Fletcher had packed. Adelaide smiled faintly. "My father believed daughters should be as capable as sons. He taught me when I was 12. He sounds like a wise man." "He was," she said softly. "He and my mother died in a typhoid outbreak 2 years ago. That's why I took the teaching position in Pinecrest. There was nothing left for me in Boston." Bronson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It takes courage to leave everything behind and start fresh. Or desperation," she countered. "Sometimes they're the same thing." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a different quality of quiet, thoughtful rather than wary. When Bronson finally spoke again, his voice had a hesitancy she hadn't heard before. "What will you do once you reach Pinecrest? Will you still take the teaching position?" Adelaide stared into the fire. "If they'll still have me. All my references and credentials were in my trunk." "I'm sure they'll see your worth quickly enough," he said with unexpected warmth. She looked up, meeting his gaze across the flames. "And what about you? Will you return to hunting, Keller?" A shadow passed across his face. "I'll see you safely to Pinecrest, then continue gathering evidence against Daniels and his operation. Eventually, justice will catch up to them." "At what cost to you?" she asked quietly. "They nearly killed you today." Bronson poked at the fire with a stick. "Some things are worth the risk." Adelaide studied him in the firelight, the strong lines of his face, the determination in his jaw, the sadness that lingered in his eyes despite his resolve. In the span of a few days, this man had become more than a rescuer to her. He had become someone she admired, respected, and perhaps something more that she wasn't yet ready to name. They traveled for 4 days, each night making camp beneath the vast Montana sky. During their journey, Bronson taught Adelaide about the land, how to read weather from cloud patterns, how to find water in seemingly barren terrain, which plants were edible in an emergency. In return, she shared stories from her teaching experiences and her life in Boston. Gradually, the barriers between them lowered. Adelaide learned about Bronson's childhood on the ranch, his time at a boarding school in St. Louis, where his mother had insisted he receive a proper education, and his dreams for expanding his cattle operation. "I want to build something that lasts," he told her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Something my children could inherit someday." "Do you have children?" she asked, realizing how little she knew of his personal life. He smiled slightly. "No. I would need a wife first, and suitable candidates are scarce in these parts." Adelaide felt a blush warm her cheeks and was grateful for the fading light that hid it. Surely there must be many women who would welcome the chance to be mistress of Whispering Pines. "Perhaps," he acknowledged. "But I've never been one to settle for convenience. My parents had a love match, despite their different backgrounds. I'd want the same." His eyes met hers briefly before returning to the horizon, leaving Adelaide with a flutter in her chest she couldn't quite suppress. On the 5th day, they crested a ridge to see Pinecrest spread below them, a small but tidy settlement nestled in a valley, with a church steeple rising above the other buildings. "Your new home," Bronson said, gesturing toward the town. Adelaide felt a curious reluctance as they began their descent. After the dangers and intimacies of their journey, the prospect of saying goodbye to Bronson struck her with unexpected force. They rode directly to the home of Harold Banks, the head of Pinecrest School Board, who greeted them with surprise and concern when Adelaide explained what had delayed her arrival. "My dear Miss Calloway, we feared the worst when you didn't arrive on schedule," Banks said, ushering them into his parlor where his wife fussed over Adelaide's travel-worn appearance. "We had no idea about the robbery." The stage-coach company reported only that the coach had been delayed due to unforeseen circumstances. "Mr. O'Malley saved my life," Adelaide said, glancing at Bronson, who stood uncomfortably in the formal setting, hat in hand. "Without him, I would never have reached Pinecrest." Banks shook Bronson's hand vigorously. "We're in your debt, sir. Please, you must stay for dinner. Both of you look in need of a good meal." Despite Bronson's protests that he should start back, the Bankses insisted, and soon they were seated at a well-appointed table with the couple and their teenage daughter. Throughout the meal, Adelaide found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Bronson, noting how his quiet strength seemed to fill the room despite his few words. After dinner, while Mrs. Banks showed Adelaide to the room that would be hers until the schoolteacher's cottage was ready, Bronson and Mr. Banks discussed the situation with Sheriff Daniels. "I'll write to the territorial governor myself," Banks promised. "Such corruption cannot stand." When Adelaide returned to the parlor, she found Bronson preparing to leave. "You're going tonight?" she asked, unable to keep dismay from her voice. "Best to put some miles behind me before dark," he replied, though his eyes conveyed a reluctance that matched her own. Banks and his wife tactfully withdrew, leaving them alone in the parlor. "I don't know how to thank you," Adelaide said softly, "for everything." Bronson stepped closer, his hat still clutched in his hands. "Knowing you're safe is thanks enough. Will I see you again?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. Something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or yearning. "Would you want to?" "Yes," she answered simply, honestly. He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to step back, and touched her cheek with gentle fingers. "Then you will." "I promise." The touch lingered, warm and promising, before he withdrew his hand. With a final nod, he turned and left, the sound of his spurs fading as he walked to his horse. Adelaide watched from the window as he mounted and rode away, a lone figure against the setting sun. Only when he disappeared from view did she realize she was clutching the locket at her throat, the one possession Keller's men hadn't taken, as it had been hidden beneath her high-necked dress. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as Adelaide settled into her role as Pinecrest schoolteacher. The town welcomed her warmly, and she found joy in working with her students, who ranged from 6 to 16 years old. The schoolteacher's cottage, though small, became a cozy home, and she gradually acquired replacements for her lost possessions. Yet amid her new life, thoughts of Bronson remained constant. She found herself watching the road from her classroom window, hoping to see a familiar rider on a chestnut mare. Each letter that arrived in the weekly mail delivery made her heart leap, though none came bearing his name. True to his word, Mr. Banks had written to the territorial governor about Sheriff Daniels and Keller's operation. 2 weeks after Adelaide's arrival in Pinecrest, a federal marshal arrived to take her official statement. The investigation was proceeding, he assured her, though these matters took time. "Has there been any word of Wyatt Keller's whereabouts?" she asked. "None confirmed," the marshal replied. "But we're looking. You're safe here, Miss Calloway." Adelaide nodded, though she wondered if anyone was truly safe while men like Keller remained free. Autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, and still no word came from Bronson. Adelaide tried to focus on her teaching, on building relationships in her new community, on creating the life she had come west to find. Yet at night, alone in her cottage, she would remember the feel of his arms around her as they rode together, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her across the campfire. Had she imagined the connection between them? Perhaps for him, it had been merely duty, the fulfillment of a promise to see her safely to her destination. November brought the first snows, dusting Pinecrest with white and bringing with it the realization that mountain passes would soon be closed until spring. If Bronson hadn't come by now, he likely wouldn't until the thaw. On a crisp Saturday morning, Adelaide was hanging curtains she had sewn for her cottage windows when a knock came at her door. Expecting Mrs. Banks, who often brought baked goods on weekends, she called, "Come in." Without turning from her task, "The blue suits you," came a deep, familiar voice. "It matches your eyes." Adelaide spun around, nearly falling from the chair she stood on. Bronson O'Malley stood in her doorway, his tall frame filling the space, a small trunk in his hands. "You're here," she breathed, too stunned for more eloquent words. He set down the trunk and moved forward, offering his hand to help her down from the chair. When her feet touched the floor, he didn't release her, instead drawing her slightly closer. "I apologize for not coming sooner," he said. There were matters that needed resolution. Adelaide found her voice. "What matters?" Keller, for one. A grim satisfaction crossed his face. "He's been arrested along with Sheriff Daniels. The federal marshal caught them trying to flee to Canada with money they'd stolen. They'll stand trial in Helena this spring." "That's wonderful news," she said sincerely. "There's more." He gestured to the trunk. "I believe these belong to you." Curious, Adelaide knelt to open it, gasping when she saw her books, teaching materials, and several personal items that had been in her stolen trunk. "How did you find these?" "They were being held as evidence once Keller was captured. I convinced the marshal you needed them more than he did." Bronson hesitated. "There's something else, something I needed to ask you in person." Adelaide rose slowly, her heart suddenly pounding. "Yes." Bronson took a deep breath. "I've spent these weeks putting my affairs in order, making sure Whispering Pines would be secure, and thinking about what I really want for my future." His eyes held hers steadily. "I find that future empty without you in it, Adelaide." She felt a trembling begin somewhere deep inside her. "What are you saying, Bronson?" He took her hands in his. "I'm saying that when I first saw you on that auction block, something changed in me. And every day since, I've thought of nothing but returning to you." His voice grew softer. "I'm asking if you might consider a life with me, not out of gratitude or obligation, but because you might feel as I do." "And how do you feel?" she whispered, needing to hear the words. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I began loving you when you took up my rifle to defend my home, when you showed more courage than most men I've known. And I continued falling in love with you around campfires and on mountain trails, discovering your mind, your heart, your spirit." Tears welled in Adelaide's eyes. "I feared you wouldn't come back, that what I felt was one-sided." "And what do you feel?" he asked, vulnerability evident in his usually confident face. In answer, Adelaide stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Bronson's arms encircled her, drawing her close against him. When they finally parted, both breathless, Adelaide smiled up at him. "I love you too. I think I have since you said those words on the auction block. Untie her. She's coming home with me." "I meant them," he murmured, touching his forehead to hers. "Will you come home with me, Adelaide? Will you make Whispering Pines our home together?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "But what about my teaching position? The school year isn't finished. Bronson smiled. I spoke with Mr. Banks before coming here. He understands, though he says Pinecrest will be losing its finest teacher. And I've been thinking there are children at neighboring ranches who have no access to schooling. Perhaps you could establish a school at Whispering Pines. The thoughtfulness of his plan, the way he had considered her needs alongside his own, only deepened Adelaide's certainty. This was a man who would be a true partner, who respected her abilities and dreams as much as his own. When would we leave? She asked. After Christmas, he replied. I wouldn't take you away from your students before the holiday celebrations. And he looked suddenly uncertain. I thought perhaps we might be married here, among your new friends, before making the journey to the ranch. Adelaide's heart swelled with joy. Nothing would make me happier. They were married 2 weeks later in Pinecrest's small church, with the entire town in attendance. Adelaide wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Banks helped sew, and Bronson stood tall and handsome in a new black suit. As they exchanged vows, Adelaide thought of the twisted path that had brought her to this moment. The terror of the auction block transformed into the greatest joy she had ever known. When spring came, they returned to Whispering Pines Ranch, where Mrs. Fletcher welcomed Adelaide with tears and open arms. True to their plans, Adelaide established a school for the children of neighboring ranchers, while also embracing her role as mistress of Whispering Pines. Years passed, bringing children of their own 2 sons and a daughter who filled the ranch house with laughter and life. The library grew as Adelaide added volumes of her own choosing alongside those of Bronson's mother. Whispering Pines flourished under their joint stewardship, becoming known throughout the territory for its hospitality and fairness. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work done, Bronson and Adelaide would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains. Sometimes they spoke of the day they met, of the auction block that fell silent when a determined cowboy refused to let injustice stand. I rescued you that day, Bronson would say, holding her close, but you've been saving me ever since. Adelaide would smile, knowing it was true for both of them that in finding each other, they had each found salvation, purpose, and a love that had transformed their lives in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful day in Silver Creek.